In 1936, Edward VIII became King of the United Kingdom. He was set on marrying Wallis Simpson, an American socialite and multiple divorcee. Yet this soon resulted in a political crisis and the King's abdication. In the years that followed, further scandals erupted, and it has even been speculated that the couple were plotting something sinister with the Nazis. But to understand how all of this came to be, we must go back to the late 19th century. The woman known to posterity as Wallis Simpson was actually born as Bessie Wallace Warfield on the 19th of June 1896 at the Monterey Inn in Blue Ridge Summit in Pennsylvania. She was born into a prominent Baltimore business family. Her father was Henry Warfield, a flour merchant who made enough money from selling the humble product that in 1875 he was able to finance a campaign to become mayor of Baltimore, though one which was ultimately unsuccessful. Wallis's mother, Alice, also hailed from a business family. Her father was William Montague, a successful stockbroker of the late 19th century. Despite her parents' affluence, Wallis's childhood was difficult. Her father died from tuberculosis in November 1896, less than 6 months after her birth. To compound matters, her mother's relationship with her family was strained, perhaps owing to the fact that Wallis had been born out of wedlock. As such, Alice and Wallis relied on the charity of Henry Warfield's brother, Solomon, Wallis's uncle, for much of her youth growing up in Baltimore. During this time, Wallis excelled in her schooling and emerged in the 1910s as an intelligent young woman. On the 8th of November 1916, Wallis married Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a US Navy pilot who she had met just over 6 months earlier on a visit to Florida. It was not a happy union. Spencer, it soon transpired, was an alcoholic, one who liked to even fly drunk. He once crashed into the sea, but escaped largely unharmed. By the late 1910s, the relationship was fractured, and Wallis and Earl were partially separated. They remained married until 1927, but for many years they saw little of each other, as he was based in various army bases in the United States, while Wallis travelled abroad regularly, spending time in China, Hong Kong, Paris and other locations. 8 months after Wallis's divorce from her first husband was finalised, she married Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American shipping executive with extensive business interests in Britain. Accordingly, they married in London, and it was here where they primarily lived over the next several years. Marital bliss did not last long, and they were both unfaithful, although their marriage lasted on paper for nearly a decade. This second marriage did not result in children, nor did any of Wallis's other unions. It was during her marriage to Ernest that Wallis met Edward, Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne of Britain. This was in January 1931. They remained acquainted thereafter, but it was seemingly not until 1934 that their relationship became sexual, although Wallis would remain officially married to Ernest until 1937. The Prince and Wallis's relationship was deemed problematic by the royal family and the British government as soon as details of it came to light. In the 1930s, divorce was still considered controversial, and the idea that the heir to the throne would marry an American woman and one who had divorced her first husband and committed adultery in her second marriage when she became entangled with Edward was viewed as being scandalous. Accordingly, the British Secret Services and Metropolitan Police opened a dossier on Wallis in 1935. The controversy surrounding Wallis's relationship with Edward came to a head in 1936, when the prince's father, King George V, died. Edward automatically ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. He had every intention of marrying Wallis, who had filed for divorce from Ernest and was known to have told her friends and acquaintances at the time that she expected to soon become queen. The government, though, had other ideas. The Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his ministers began manoeuvring behind the scenes to have the prince's younger brother Albert prepared to step in the breach if Edward needed to be removed as king if the controversy exploded. And that is exactly what happened. When Edward made it clear that he intended to press ahead with marrying Wallis, Baldwin's government made it clear that British society would not tolerate her as queen. Thus, on the 11th of December 1936, less than 11 months after his accession, Edward abdicated the throne and was succeeded by Albert, who took the name George VI as king. Following Edward's abdication, the government was anxious that the former king and his soon-to-be wife would disappear from British public life to the greatest extent possible. As such, when plans were floated for them to move to France, George VI and Baldwin's administration did everything possible to facilitate this. Edward and Wallis were to be granted the titles of Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and they were afforded an enormous sum of money and ongoing pension in order for them to live comfortably abroad. With this in place, the former monarch and his would-be bride finally married in the south of France on the 3rd of June 1937, shortly after Wallis finally obtained her divorce from Ernest. The newlyweds settled in Paris thereafter. One might have thought that the Windsors would settle down in the French capital and try to avoid any further controversy, but that was not the case. Edward, with Wallis' support, was seemingly determined to try and carve out a new position for himself as an unofficial ambassador of British royal interests abroad. As part of this effort to foster new links, Edward and Wallis decided on a foreign trip in the autumn of 1937 to a country which could not have been more controversial. They would visit Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1937, Dr. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, had invited Edward and Wallis to visit Germany. By early autumn of 1937, the Windsors had accepted the offer, and news of the impending visit was related to the British government, who were not pleased in the slightest at this latest development. The Windsors arrived to Friedrichstraße train station in Berlin on the 11th of October for what would be a near 2-week visit. Their activities were generally fairly mundane, involving tours of German factories and social organizations, but throughout they were wined and dined by leading members of the Nazi regime, including the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring, the head of the newly formed German Air Force and Hitler's second in command. Finally, Wallis and Edward concluded their 2-week stay in Germany with a personal audience with Adolf Hitler at his alpine retreat, the Berghof, on the southern border between Germany and Austria. There are varying accounts of what was said during these meetings and what was being planned between the Windsors and the Nazis, but as we will see, the whole visit took on a more sinister edge in light of events in subsequent years. Wallis and Edward returned to Paris after the visit to Germany. There they witnessed Europe hurtling towards war in the months that followed as their new friend, Adolf Hitler, began annexing some of Germany's neighbours. Austria was annexed into a Greater Germany in March 1938, followed by Czechoslovakia a year later. When the Nazis then invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France determined that they could no longer appease Hitler and declared war on Germany. Thus, the Second World War had begun. Wallis and Edward continued to live in Paris in the months following the outbreak of the war. They, like many Parisians, would have believed they were relatively safe there, away from the front lines of the expected invasion of France in the northeast of the country. But when that invasion came on the early summer of 1940, it resulted in a blistering military victory for the Nazis, and German tank divisions began to close on Paris within a few weeks of the initial incursion into France. As they did, Wallis and her husband fled south, crossing over the border into Spain and heading onwards to Portugal. In Lisbon, one of the most controversial and peculiar sequence of events concerning Wallis and Edward occurred. Firstly, the Nazi regime was conspiring to try and lure the couple back into Spain, where they would seek to detain them and bring them to Germany as bargaining pieces in Germany's conflict with Britain. Edward and Wallis were unaware of this plan, which was unsuccessful in any event, but they themselves were seemingly plotting treason against Britain itself. In Lisbon, Wallis and Edward were residing at the house of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker who had extensive business connections in Germany. Santo was suspected of having extensive contacts with Hitler and the Nazis. Accordingly, the British intelligence services had opened a file on him. Moreover, correspondence between Edward and Santo in the subsequent period would seem to indicate that Edward might have been plotting a possible return to the throne of Britain. Though the evidence is not conclusive, many have speculated that Edward was using Santo as a liaison with the Nazi government, and that plans were afoot for Edward to be restored to the throne of Britain if the Germans defeated the country in the war. Thus, Wallis and her husband were possibly conspiring with the Nazis during the Second World War with the goal of becoming king and queen, half a decade after Edward's shameful abdication. We may never know the full truth of what Wallis and Edward were planning while in Portugal in the summer of 1940. Just a few weeks later, the British government arranged for them to take a ship in Lisbon and head for the Bahamas, where Edward was given the position of governor for the duration of the war, a ploy which served to keep the pair out of Britain. They spent the remainder of the Second World War here, with whatever plans they might have concocted with the Nazis falling to dust as the Nazis gradually began to lose the war from the winter of 1941 onwards. Wallis and Edward resumed their life as royal exiles in Paris in the aftermath of the Second World War. Fleeting bits of evidence continue to appear over the years concerning their apparent brief alliance with the Nazis, and the meetings they'd had with the senior members of the regime in October 1937 cast a shadow over them for the remainder of their lives. Nevertheless, they continued to hold a kind of celebrity status in Paris and on visits to the United States in the 1950s. Edward's health deteriorated in the 1960s, in large part owing to his lifelong habit of chain smoking and a family predisposition to lung problems. He eventually died in May 1972 in Paris, aged 77. His body was taken back to England for a royal funeral, at which there was a surprising display of grief by the British public for the monarch who had briefly been king in 1936 and whose life had otherwise been shrouded in controversy. Wallis continued to live in France after Edward's passing. She was financially supported by her late husband's estate and an allowance from Queen Elizabeth II of Britain. Her own health was declining by this time, and in the late 1970s, she developed dementia. From 1980 onwards, she lost the ability to speak. Thus, her last years were spent housebound and with her mental faculties deteriorating. Eventually, Wallis died in the French capital on the 24th of April 1986, at 89 years of age. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle in England, and she was interred next to Edward, near Windsor Castle. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Wallis Simpson. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and also what do you guys think they were plotting. I know she isn't as much of a forgotten life, but I think a lot of people don't know her full story, and also this was suggested by my mother. Also, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.